Hello, so here's a new preset build for you, and hopefully under 10 minutes. Sort of Eric Johnson vibes, clean chorus with a bit of a twist, but we'll get to that. Go to our quick build within the Fractal editor. We have an in and an out. We'll hook these two together. We'll have an amp and a cab. So we'll place those right there in the middle. We're going to have a delay towards the end, and then a reverb right at the end, and then we're also going to be using a chorus. I'll put that just there, and I'll use a filter block at the start as sort of like a cleaner boost because I'm using the Strat, so the output from the pickups isn't that high, so I like to put an extra clean boost into the amp they're going to be using. And then we're going to be using a parallel chain today. It's one of my favorite things to do. And on the parallel chain, the thinking behind this is that it's going to add the sparkle to the clean sound. So it's going to be, I guess, more hi-fi, wider range. And then we're going to be able to dial that in depending on how much of that we want to spruce up our clean tone, or in this case, our chorusy modulated clean tone. So for this, we'll add blocks just above the amp, and it's going to surround the amp and the cab, and then it's going to join again at the end, and then go into the same chorus, and then delay and reverb at the end to make this kind of lush modulated sound. Difference here is I'm going to be using a drive block right at the start of this parallel chain, and the reasoning behind that is to give it sort of like a console vibe. So if you think, and you're plugging into sort of those older, maybe analog consoles, there's sort of gain knobs on there, and maybe they had some kind of drive circuit or preamp gain circuit or mic preamp that gave it some character, and that's what I'm going to try and sort of replicate here. Be using a compressor. We leave this block free, and I'll get to that in a bit. We use our second delay up here, and at the end we're going to be using a volume pan block. And the reason for this block is to have a more, the way I put it is to have a more visual sort of blend of how much of this parallel chain that you want. You can of course use your usual, your level if you want, but I find that using the volume block in this case means that you have a 0 to 10 scale, and then you can just blend it in with that in mind. So let's start off with the amp and cab. I'll note we're in stereo today, so we're going to be using some tricks here and there to widen our sound and get a much bigger sort of sound stage, which will sound very lush as well. So for our amp, we're going to be using the high power jumped. I think this is basically the stock settings. I won't change anything here. You can tweak depending on what kind of sound you want out of this. I left it here as it seemed to work quite well. And then for our cab, we're going to be using two cabs. So the Brit 70s GB57C, Brit 70s GB121C. I put both of these in ultra res as we have some CPU to spare. And this is where it gets interesting. For the cab block, we're not hard panning both cabs left and right. So we're going about 65% in both directions. My thinking behind this is that the delays and the reverbs are going to fill up that sort of extra space that's sort of out there, if that makes sense. And our guitar cabs or our clean tone here from the amp and cab will be somewhere around there, if it makes sense. And then the sparkle, which I'll get to, is sort of living in that kind of space as well. And that's why we get this kind of nice depth, not only to the modulation, but to the sound stage. And yeah, the filter block, I'm just using it because of the Strat, as I noted before, so I feel like I need a bit more of a bump going into the amp itself. So this is with like a 6 dB boost. You can adjust this, of course, to taste, as it will affect the parallel chain as well. Very bland and basic, you might say, but we'll get to the magic, don't worry. And so for the chorus block, we're going to be using the Dimension 2 in stock settings. Haven't changed anything here. And this is what that sounds like. I felt with the chorus that this had the best sort of widening effect, and it seemed to work well with the other blocks that we're going to be using. So for the delay, we're going to be using wandering delays. This one. It's the stock settings. The only thing I've changed here is I've upped the mix to 18% because I felt that kind of worked quite well. And we're using a quarter note on the left tempo and a dotted eighth on the right tempo. And then with the reverb at the end, it'll be a nice big reverb. So we're using the large hall with 5 seconds and then a 25% mix. I will note in these blocks, I'm also changing under the EQ tab, the low cut frequency to 100. The rest I'm not touching, but in the reverb block, EQ, the low cut's 100. In the delay block, this one as well, and this delay block as well. We'll get to that in just a second. The idea behind this is that it keeps things a bit clearer, and we're getting less, I guess, mud, if you want to call it, or low end build up below. So you get this nice, lush, clear, clean tone. And now we'll get to the parallel chain, which is, or as I call it, the sparkle side of things. So we know what this sounds like below, and now we'll listen to just the top parallel path. And the way I've done this to make things easier is I've set the bypass mode of the amp to mute. So when I bypass this, that's nothing, you won't hear anything from the guitar. So now we're only going to hear the parallel chain on top, which kind of helps to dial it in as well. So we'll connect up the different blocks up here to the drive. We can skip from the drive to the volume at the end, goes right through, and we head back down here below. So as I said before, the volume block is really handy to sort of dial in how much of this parallel chain that you want. I find it easier than using the level personally for something like this, because then you have a very visual and easy way to dial in the mix. So between 0 and 10 or 0 and 100%. Now, as I said before, with the drive block, the thinking behind it is that it's like plugging into an analog console, you've got a mic preamp or a nice mic preamp. In this case, we're using the FET preamp for the drive block. We're just going to lower the drive so we don't get any breakup to 3.5. And I liked a bit of a higher tone that seemed to give it a bit of a brighter edge, which was quite nice in this case with the Strat. So I put that at 6.5. For the compressor, we're using our Studio FF compressor. These aren't the stock settings, but when you add them in, this is what you're going to get off the bat. Definitely take auto makeup off, put the knee type to soft, and then for the threshold, I found that -30 was working well with the Strat. For the delay, we're going to be using the Deluxe Mind Guy, which is like the Deluxe Memory Man. Again, the 100 Hertz cutoff. And then we're using a quarter note tap tempo. Make sure to put the right post delay up to around 3 or 4 to give a bit more width and movement. 30% feedback, and I quite like 15% mix here. You can dial to taste. So now we're just going to be hearing that parallel chain. So that sounds pretty nice on its own, but this is where the fun starts, when we add in our amp and cab and the sound we had before, and then we start playing around with the mix of the parallel chain. So I'll leave this at 0, and we'll just hear the amp and cab as we did before. now this is adding the sparkle, as it were. There's going to be a volume boost, but it also adds some texture, I find. So obviously there's a big volume difference between the two, and you're hearing, I think, more of the parallel chain because it's just so hi-fi. And this is where you can play around with the mix level. So if I set this to 5, which is just in the middle, so it's a lot of fun to play around with that. Just be wary of the amount of volume that you're going to get from the preset, given that the parallel chain adds a lot of volume to the actual preset. You can set the overall level at the end here, should you want to do that. And now the reason why I left this block empty is, depending on the guitar you're using, you can add in, for example, another EQ. So we use, say, a parametric EQ. And something that's really cool, I'll put a link in the description, is from Leon Todd's block library, which was a gift of tone, I believe it was last year. And in there is his humbucker to single coil EQ within the parametric EQ block. And so if you have a humbucker guitar, you can add a different sort of hi-fi sound going behind your main clean tone to add a bit of variety. I'll show that in an example now. You can also experiment with other blocks. You can put another delay there if you want, making sure the compressor is up here instead, for example. You can even try another chorus, another modulation. I found with an extra chorus here, it got a bit too muddy for my liking, but again, it's up to you to experiment. So I've saved this preset, it's in the description below. Hope you enjoy it, have fun, experiment with it. As always, thanks for the support. If you like this kind of content, please drop a like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks a lot.